Good afternoon. Jeez, did everyone play ping pong last night or something? I'm exhausted, but that was a very low level good afternoon. Anyway, hi, my name is Amado Gramajo. I am a vice president at Nasdaq. I manage a few teams: observability, DevOps engineering, and some infrastructure teams. I have global field CTO from GitLab, Lee Faust, joining us, and our talk today is going to be about building an onboarding COE for AWS, going beyond automation. COE, I think we were targeting center of enablement versus center of excellence. I think it's more appropriate for us. And we have the agenda. It's a couple of buckets. It's pretty small contained, but there's a lot. It's dense, and we can talk about each of these buckets for a pretty long time. So first off, we're going to start with talking about what is an engineering platform engineering mindset. Platform engineering is not a new concept. It's been around in technology for a long time. It's kind of making its turn again the last 2 years. You'll start seeing more of it more and more. We'll talk a little bit about that transition. We'll also talk about building the actual cloud onboarding COE. And we'll also have one example, a real-world example of how to introduce Refactor Readiness into your app modernization pipeline, and some approaches that we've used and things that's worked for us for a lot of our applications. And finally, we'll wrap up the talk with measurements, because measurements and baselines are very important for us to measure our growth, our baseline, to see where we're going. And we'll show you what capabilities GitLab has in order to enable that for us. Okay, so here is the famous 2x2s. You'll see these 2x2s everywhere in AWS documentation. I did not create them. I've actually pivoted them. So, they work for this talk, so here they are. And from left to right, it's kind of a sequence of, where platform engineering was and how we operated within the IT organization for each of these separate teams. On the left, which is transitional for us because everyone's trying to move away from that kind of mode of operating, you'll see that you have your application engineering team, which is your software development. You have application operations, usually that's application management. You have platform engineering, which was whatever team managed whatever platform was being used. And then you have the ops team that usually supports all the platforms. And back in those days, there really wasn't an ITSM function. It was kind of scatter gather, right? You just threw something over the fence. Maybe you had some type of SOP, and ITSM was probably I want to say the loudest, probably the most annoying guy who thought he was the smartest in the room that said, hey, this is going to break something else. But it wasn't a real formal process. It wasn't really an ITSM type of operation. And that happened for a couple of years, around the 90s. And then you move forward, and we start to see ITIL starts getting introduced. So we start seeing a lot of work becomes ticket-driven. We have Jira, we have standards, we have change control. You start to see the platform engineering teams owning more of their platform. This is like things like whether it's on-prem, hybrid cloud, private cloud, hypervisors, any platform that's being hosted. You're starting to see these teams that were previously ops start to become these platform engineering teams in support of application engineering. At the same time, you start seeing SRE type of functions growing within app engineering, right? You start seeing a lot of automation. You start seeing the introduction of infrastructure as code, whether it's CloudFormation or some native tool or Terraform. You start to begin to leverage the concept of infrastructure as code. Along with that, you start to see configuration management, right? Ansible, Salt, whatever, Puppet, whatever else is out there. You start to see a lot of this automation happening in delivery through pipelines that's fully automated. And that's pretty much kind of like where a lot of us are in terms of our journey to platform engineering. But lately, what we've started to see, and I've seen in speaking with Lee over many conversations, is going beyond the automation, we start to think about opportunity cost. So you look at our developers and they're spending a lot of time working on infrastructure code, right? They're working on helping SREs glue together, build more automation. But then the question becomes, value, right? Are our developers, application engineers really supposed to be working on that? What is the business value of that for the business? The main functionality or the main core role for a developer is to create software. And that's the software that the business requires for a competitive advantage or competitive edge, right? And a developer can't build value into that code if he's spending his time working on infrastructure, right? So that's where the growth of the platform engineering team starts to show itself. And you have concepts like DevRel, Dev Experience, and all these other kind of improvements into the overall way of how developers work. And you start to see that, hey, you know what? The developer, for me as an operations guy, is my primary customer. And the primary customer for application development is the business, right? So you start to look at these value streams, what they mean, and you start to adjust the onboarding process so that the developers have stacks in place that help them deliver faster, right? Increasing their velocity for delivery. You start to see more of the training as part of the platform, right? So that developers aren't reinventing the wheel, right? All this, is the idea of moving from a developer that is managing infrastructure as code to more of being a consumer of a PaaS that is managed by a platform engineering team, right? And the platform engineering team itself can be, a number of different groups. There's nothing, defined. Each company has their historical way of supporting these platforms. So they may be DevOps, they may be SRE, whatever it is. The main goal is to support the developers and help the developers fulfill their goals so that the business is happy, we get more money, and everyone grows together, right? And that kind of experience is what I've seen in the enterprise for finance, but you'll also see this starting to happen for companies that are born in cloud. I don't know how many companies here are born in cloud. How many companies, guys here, are you working for pure play cloud companies? Enterprises?
Enterprises?
No one. Are you all management? What's going on? Enterprise architect? Oh, wow. Okay, we have spies. So we need more budget and improve our designs. But yeah, so you start to see this happening with like companies that are pure plays. I'm thinking about like the Etsy's of the world, where they had developers working on different subsystems that were owned independently, and as they start to scale, the developers started to lose track about which versions to use, who's doing what. It kind of became the Wild Wild West, and now you see these companies moving toward this platform engineering approach as well. So it's not just the enterprise, it's also you'll also see it in companies that are starting to scale, right, and trying to also tie their business outcome to what they're doing operationally in terms of delivering a platform.
So one of the things Amado and I meet every other week, just talk about things that we see in the industry, things that are going on inside of GitLab, things that are going on inside of Nasdaq, and then even outside of friends, colleagues that we have outside. And one of the things we find very interesting about this slide is we start to think about resource utilization. And that last slide can sometimes be misleading. That, so what you're telling me is I spend a whole bunch of money in platform engineering today, and what I'll be able to do is I can get rid of half of my platform engineering team in 3 years once everything's good. How do you see that at Nasdaq being able to play out when you think about, the platform engineering team? Are you using the automation, all these value streams, things like that, to hopefully someday be able to shrink that team and grow the the application engineering teams? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's not an exercise where we're looking to reduce the engineering, footprint. It's more of improving our software lifecycle. Engineers sometimes get stuck being transacted, working on, tickets, right? That don't necessarily engineer a solution that solves a bigger problem. So by having this process, my hope is that we get to release a lot of the cycles in the work within our engineers that are, less toil and more geared to improving the software, improving the pipeline,
Yep.
right, and delivery of that software for our developers. So it's not about removing, responsibility of something from engineers. It's about improving the bandwidth that they have to work on other solutions, right? To move from an operator transactional mindset to one of an engineering mindset, which is to build and solve.
So on the development side, one of the things I love about the relationship that we have with Nasdaq at GitLab is Amato and I, the first time that we met in New York, we saw that there was an immediate relationship between how platform engineering, operations, and then the developer experience, development relationship, how those two things actually play together to be able to drive cloud adoption. And one of the things that we talk about at GitLab is how we use those values and how important those values are. And one of the things that we hear from every executive that we talk to is about securing the software supply chain. And you have to go beyond automation to be able to really secure the software supply chain. And you've got to collect a lot of data. And that's one of the things that a lot of companies miss out in. And if we look across all of these different phases from your software factory into what I call software logistics, which is the delivery of those applications to wherever they may go, there's inputs and outputs around each one of these boxes. And when we look at GitLab and how Nasdaq is using it today, they are able to immediately see return on investment at each one of these different segments by being able to correlate that data without having to go to a third-party data lake or to have to use Tableau or to be able to export it into Excel and create a bunch of charts. They can see that value immediately inside of GitLab, and it allows us to be able to remove a lot of that toil that we go through when we're running a CAB or architecture reviews or things like that. You can just pull up a dashboard inside of GitLab and be able to see those things. What are some of the other ways that you guys are looking at using some of this data, either on the operations side, how you feed that back to your product teams? How are you looking at software supply chain security at Nasdaq?
Yeah, so security is top of mind for everything, and a lot of sessions here, even if they're not security, you've probably mentioned security. And really for looking at this software supply chain, one of the key things is the consistency, right? An engineer should know what the process is to create a war, and it should be consistent across, every build. With security overlaid at that, you want to add more to that consistency and do your scanning, and you want to make sure that it repeats and it enacts every time the pipeline kicks off. But you also want to be able to produce reports and audits, right? One of the key things that we're doing with our pipeline is we want to create sort of an audit lake where, previously we would have to work very hard to produce artifacts, but now we want to look at ways to automate that, from the software factory perspective to logistically make all that data available to our internal audit team, to cyber, so that it's there at their fingertips, and the time for them to get that data is smaller and smaller. You don't have to set up a meeting that gets bumped because no one wants to meet with internal audit, sorry. But, it's valid, there's a chain of custody, there's rules, it's consistent, it's repeatable, and it's provable. And it's all part of the security And when you consider security, it has to be across all these components, right? And you have to be able to audit and review and report. Yeah, and that kind of like ties us to the first slide where software engineering has a software factory, and then platform engineering is on the logistics.
So as we've been working with AWS jointly with Nasdaq and GitLab, AWS has been a great partner for both of us, providing a lot of really in-depth knowledge about how other customers are doing things. And one of the things that came out at one of the summits, one of the first summits I went to was in Washington, D.C. at the PubSec, and I met the PS team lead, and they were just announcing what they called the landing zone acceleration project. So that got us thinking, if I can create a paved path for creating landing zones, and I can accelerate the account creation and the monitoring and all of the other third-party things that I need to secure the infrastructure, what does that look like inside of a company like Nasdaq that can consume that and be able to use it really easily? So these landing zone project templates, how many people here have seen the landing zone accelerator templates?
They're all managers.
Oh, they're all managers?
Yeah. No one raises their hands. They're all tied from ping pong.
Or whiskey.
Or whiskey.
So these managed landing zones, a lot of customers are starting to go down the path of building out these smaller areas because so many people that have started using AWS, I'm an example. I always thought that when I would go to use AWS, what I do is I just log into the console and click, and I get a VM and I can start playing around. And now as enterprises are really using that platform mentality for AWS, as all of these different resources that they can consume, they need a way to be able to break them up and then have accounts across each one of them. And with those accounts, we then have things like dev test, and we've got our production organizational units that then have resources that are deployed underneath those accounts. And it allows us to be able to have traceability. And I gave a presentation, it was a webinar about a month ago, and I talked about Git workflows for platform engineers. And Amato and I, when I first talked to him about it, and we were going through, and he was like, wow, why aren't more people doing it this way? And the way that you can do things with Git is you can have different remotes. And I can have a remote that points to a playbook in Ansible, a project that has all of my playbooks for EC2. I can have another one that's pointing to my EKS CDK. And then I can have my Spring Boot application. And so I have 3 different remotes, but Amato's team, where they go ahead and build all the standardization around all these different templates, they go and find a security issue in one of the configuration files. They can make that modification, and all I need to do is just do a Git pull. And I now have that immediately at my disposal, and that will immediately kick off a new pipeline run so I can make sure that my infrastructure is always up to date and redeploy the application on the fly. So these landing zones are becoming really critical. At Nasdaq, how are you thinking about how landing zones are used inside of Nasdaq? Is it project-based? Are you doing it at a central level? How are you thinking about that?
It is project-based, and we have a very mature pipeline that we've been using for several years now, and it's always improving depending on, user request. But it's basically like what you see here, right? You have the OU, and then there's an approval process. Everything's automated, tied back to a service desk, so you have the audit, the tracking, the history. We also include a financial component as part of this process and review, and we also have enterprise architecture and cyber review anything that we're doing before we push the account out. But everything you just described is exactly how we're running our pipeline. There's things we can improve, and we always do. But this is the model that we've chosen, and it's one that's worked for us. We're able to deploy, we're able to meet the demand of our users as they request accounts, And we're also able to lay over some governance so that we see, well, how many accounts are there, what they're doing, are they using their pipelines correctly, and the guardrails within the pipeline. That's all centralized, right? The CPE team does a very good job with that. And, so it's product-based, but it's a centralized management perspective, right? Because we do have a team that kind of acts as, government to review everything that gets approved, so that we don't have, just all these types of services out there going on. So it's exactly like this. It gives us speed. Deployment is really fast, and scaling is, just a push of a button.
So I loved one of the words that you used there when you talked about guardrails. I hear a lot of customers, especially this week. I was telling Amato at breakfast this morning that I'm hearing it over and over again that we're being asked to do more with less in the current economic climate. And almost 9 out of 10 conversations, the words that I heard over and over again were paved path. I want a paved path. I want somebody, and I don't want to have to create it. I want to just grab it and reuse it. And a lot of the things when we talk about moving faster to one company, I struggle a little bit. There was a book that I was an editor on that was called Better Software Faster, and it was written in 2001. And so I hear a lot of vendors and stuff today still talking about better software faster, and I'm getting a little bit nervous. If we haven't figured out how to do it faster in 21 years, then what have we been doing in 21 years? So when we think about these paved paths, there's a concern that we hear in the industry that being able to do this in a templated fashion, you're giving control over to the developers. Do you see it as control, or do you see it as guidance?
Right, well, so these templates are reviewed, they are approved. It's more guidance, right? A developer, when you're thinking of a template, thinking about Terraform, again, back to the platform engineering mindset, they may not have the time to create their own template. They may look to leverage one that they've seen works for, a partner or a sister application, right? And the beauty of having a pipeline and having the platform team manage that, they know what that is, and they can easily make it available, release it, and the developer spends 0 time on that effort, and they can focus on their software.
Great. Yeah. So inside of GitLab has some capabilities that we've been doing a lot of level ups with prospects and customers while we've been at reInvent this week, and we are going through and showing them how you can build these paved paths into production and being able to have groups and subgroups. And I remember the first time we were meeting and we were drawing up all of the different use cases on a whiteboard, and it was eye-opening even to some of your team that I had no idea that I could isolate and have certain groups of operations teams or even subgroups of the operations teams, and they could build their own best practices and then share those best practices with other teams and with the development community as a whole. And as we started pulling out a lot of this, we can create things like a secure landing zone template and then use all those provisioning templates and stuff going forward, as well as being able to have plans. One of the things that I see a lot with infrastructure teams is I had a conversation with a customer yesterday, and they were really struggling creating their pipelines because their pipelines are trial and error. So they do a little bit and then it fails, and they're like, okay, so let me figure out what I need to change. And then it gets me a little bit farther, and then I do a little bit more, and then it gets a little bit farther. And I was like, well, did you actually write any requirements for your pipeline? And they're like, well, no, they just said I need X. And when I got X, I just asked to start building X. And so I started showing them how they could start planning these things around requirements. But the ultimate, one of the things that you said in the beginning that's so critical is a lot of times we just build this to automate. And what we're hearing from a lot of our customers is they want to automate for the purposes of collecting data. DevOps, for me, one of the best definitions I ever heard for DevOps was it's a combination of agility, collaboration, and automation. And when those 3 things come together, then what I'm able to do is collect a bunch of data about those 3 things and how they're working for you. And then that leads into platform engineering on one side and a new group that we're seeing, which is product operations on the other side. So we funnel all of that data in through a flywheel type effect for continuous improvement, continuous delivery, and that then leads back to creating better templates and updating those templates, making them more secure, things like that over time. So this is where I was talking about those Git workflows for platform engineers. A lot of times, developers have a very well-known process for working with Git, and they create branches. And the way that they create branches are sandboxes for change. And they'll create them and they'll name them like feature branch or hotfix or bug. I have yet to see a really good organization. When we were talking about this, I was like, do you guys create infrastructure branches or operations branches? I was like, wow, I didn't know I could. And this ends up becoming a best practice. Then inside of your pipelines, the data that you want to collect for operations can now be mapped back to being able to know that I can use a simple regular expression to say, hey, show me all of the pipelines that ran for changes off of every time we had an operations change or an infrastructure change. That then feeds back to your audits and compliance and regulatory needs. And then those branching strategies also allows us to be able to do code reviews. Those people that do infrastructure as code are a lot of times put out on an island. And it's really frustrating to me because as soon as you move something to code, you're a developer whether you like it or not, even Markdown. You're making documentation changes, things like that. They should all be peer reviewed. And I don't need a senior architect to do my review. One of my favorite things to do is I'll take somebody who's brand new to the organization, a junior dev, somebody else, and say, hey, could you come review this for me? And a lot of times they bring new ideas to me. I'm getting older. Unfortunately, I have bad tendencies to try to solve the same thing the same way every time. I bring a junior dev in and they're like, why did you do this? Why? And I'd be like, well, because unfortunately, that's the way I've always done it.
I know. I'm not changing.
That's right. So having these branching strategies allows for that collaboration, and then you can start to monitor things like how long is that merge request staying open? And if that merge request stays open for, let's say, whatever you want to mark that as, if it's more than 5 days, okay, well, then a manager can come along and say, why aren't you merging this? Is there a holdup? Are you waiting for another change from the product team? Whatever that looks like, those strategies become very important to how you collaborate. And we're seeing more and more SREs and platform engineers following the Spotify team models where they're actually being integrated into the app dev teams. And as they are integrated, they're going to work in the exact same code base that the developers are working in. So we need to have really good procedures in place to be able to manage that.
Yeah.
So here's a really simple way to be able to do this. So you clone, you've got fetch, then when you merge them, there's like 3 different strategies. If anybody would like to learn more about this, I can send you a link of the webinar that I did. It's about 45 minutes long. You can watch it at 3 times the speed. You'll get the same amount of value as if you watched it for 45 minutes. Now this is one of the items that once we get to this point, there's sort of 2 paths that we see people moving into the cloud today. One is workload migration, and the other one is app modernization. Unfortunately, there's an area that we're missing, and we're seeing this over and over again. And when I brought up this concept to Amato the first time, he was like, oh my gosh, like we actually just did this. Yeah. So why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about how you guys thought about this problem?
Yeah, so moving from a task, project-driven, task-based approach to a product-driven, value-based approach, a lot of the things that we have to consider, that we don't really consider is the, operational perspective, right? And operations tasks and what we consider, we've been doing them for years, 30, 50 years, and it's all about uptime, resiliency. But the one aspect that really we don't consider is, how does that affect the app dev perspective, right? If I have an app that goes down for 5 hours, high risk, high value app, and it costs the company money. How do we learn from that? How do we bring that back? Where does that fit in the value stream? Working to bring those two project, product, app dev, and operation perspective together, I think it's not done, it's not set in stone, it's something that you grow together. Like we have an operational excellence program where we started to talk a lot about this. We have tech risk reviews, but really when we look at projects and products, we don't really consider that, right? And we don't really consider the value of what that means, right, for developers. Like what is the impact? And if we're able to speak about that and document it and learn from it, it's something that we can share and it'll improve, right? Again, it goes with the concept of the center of enablement, where we have all this information, everything that we've learned, and it's available for anyone to review and grow from. So it's still a work in progress, but it's like any other of these, it's a growth process.
Great. So for us, Refactor Readiness is a term that one of the SAs at GitLab, Darwin, who works with our AWS, with our technical partnerships, he came up with the term. I have been using it because I love the term, because it means a lot to me as an engineer when I think about refactoring applications. So we talk about these two different paths. We talk about workload migration, we talk about app modernization. One of the things that we see is when I go ahead and migrate an application, what do I do from there? We see so many organizations today that their CIO, CTO comes along and says, okay, I've got a goal by 2023 that we're going to have 40% of all of our workloads in public cloud. And so what the teams do is they go, okay, hey, can you go find 40% of our applications that have like 2 users? And we'll move all of those VMs out. Yeah. But we don't actually end up in that situation. What you end up in, and that we see time and time again with our customers, is they move that workload, and then all of a sudden there's a spike in utilization. All of a sudden that application is being used over and over again, and all of a sudden people are starting to drive adoption of that particular product. And so Refactor Readiness is this concept that we start to break apart the VM that got migrated into its piece parts. So let me grab the database and let me pull that out. Let me take the API and move it to the API gateway. Let me remove the agent that I'm using for monitoring internally and let me use something like CloudWatch or something else to be able to go ahead and monitor the application. Now that I'm monitoring it and I'm getting telemetry data, I'm getting vital statistics about that application, now I can figure out what does my tech debt look like for that particular item. And over time, if I start to see that, hey, you know what, the cost is outweighing this migration, I might want to refactor it. And there's, as I started talking about this concept, there's a really interesting company, they're over in the startup booth called vFunction. And vFunction will sit inside of these VMs when you've got them up and running, and they will actually show you your tech debt. And as you target different parts of the application, as you start to refactor them and break them out into, let's say, microservices, or you break them out across multiple VMs, you'll see that tech debt start to reduce. And that helps you as a manager, as an executive, help to pinpoint where are those high value, high risk applications, and how do I make sure that the right people that need to be responsible for those are continuing to be able to work on those. And as we think about this, it goes all the way through team ops, through DevSecOps, which maps all the way back up to our digital transformation.
Yeah, and with this, we had one application that we migrated. It was our network automation platform. And the first thing we did was, shift and lift. We looked at the services that we had on-prem, and then we tried to map those out to AWS and, VMs, and we saw that there was really no benefit or value to move, and this is all in a POC account. And after that, we started looking at the services that are available in AWS, seeing that it was a low-risk change, and we just decided to modernize the app, and that kicked off the whole cycle, where meet with EA, get a new account, productionize it, meet with finance, and you have this factory and it's a cycle that it just repeats. We're trying to move away from just migrating to cloud without having an established, business value or business outcome, which goes back to those, those outcomes, like those value streams. What does this mean? What are we trying to do? And we were able to, that was actually a great example because it went from a couple of instances that we were originally going to use to just complete Lambda functions.
So that leads into a really good topic around measuring. One of the pieces that a lot of companies miss, a lot of executives miss is it's great to be able to have an OKR or KPI and you're monitoring and you're like, okay, 40%, okay, check the box. Next one, check the box. But what do you do after you check the box? Software development, I love talking when I'm hiring engineering managers. And one of my favorite questions that I ask is, how do you know when you're done? And I make them try to give a definition of what done is in software engineering. I've been a software engineer for almost 30 years, and I don't know when I'll ever be done. There's projects that I know that I worked on 25 years ago that are still living strong.
The 2001 book.
That's right, the 2001 book. So this is the case study that Amado was talking about, and something that I highly advise if you really want to learn more about how you go ahead and do this is you have to set up requirements up front, like what Amado was saying around that migration. So you go to your dev test environment and you start monitoring some things and you're like, man, something's out of whack. So when you thought about that migration, when you were talking about moving it over to Lambda functions, what were some of those critical value drivers or metrics that you were leaning in on that says, hey, you know what? This is right for us to be able to move it over.
Yeah, so we were looking at the transactions on the database, the queries that were happening. Could we leverage Lambda? Could we leverage RDS or SQS? Was SQS too slow? And it turned out that it wasn't a high throughput application, so we were able to ease off the infrastructure and lean more on the functions. But it was over, I would say it was over a period of like 6 months. It wasn't something that was done overnight.
Yep.
But the application itself and the infrastructure was pretty simple that we were able to do that migration before a year, which was pretty good.
Yeah, so as you're thinking about being able to move workloads in this way, that continuous improvement, continuous feedback loop is critical. One of the things that we were, again, talking about at breakfast is if you've got the right set of data, I can then feed this back into a financial model. Nobody likes to be measured on finance, but a lot of times, unfortunately, that's what it comes down to. Do we have budget? I was working on a project for a very large insurance company, and one of my favorite stories I tell out of that is we had what we called our lighthouse team, the team that everybody held in highest. They were building the high-profile, high-risk application, and they had the best developers, best engineers. And one of the things that we did at the beginning of the year was we built a costing model for all the different applications and made them fit everything. And they're like, oh, we're good. Like, we're thinking maybe $25 million. Like, $25 million is what it's going to cost for us. And at the end of the first quarter, we sat down. I was in the office of the CTO, and we're sitting down at the CTO, and they wanted to figure out where the highest costing applications lived. And all of a sudden, this lighthouse team all of a sudden pops up, and there's a big red mark next to them. And so we double-clicked into it to be able to look at the financial models. And in the first quarter, they had already burned $100 million of budget. And so we went back to the team, and we started asking some interesting questions. And we started talking about ephemeral workloads. And they were like, what do you mean? We said, well, what do you do in dev test? What do you do after the tests are done? Well, we spin up another cluster. What about the old cluster? Well, we might need to do a regression test, so we leave that one out there running. Could you just stop them? Yeah. We could, but you know what? It would take like 3 minutes to spin it back up again. So we just leave them running for the entire month. And so it was eye-opening for the executive teams to be able to go back and be able to say, okay, now we're going to put in some new requirements. And this is where, when we talk about going beyond automation, it's really critical to have those success metrics defined up front. A lot of times we bubble up the data, and I have seen a lot of CIOs and CTOs that will sit there and go, oh, that's interesting, because they don't know what good and bad really looks like until you start comparing it across different teams. So when we talked about this particular application, it's like, okay, well, if you could build a costing model around this and say, okay, well, originally when we moved it over for EC2, it was going to cost us $150,000 a year to run this application. By us refactoring it and being able to get it out into the market with Lambda functions and a database, maybe I drive it down to $25,000 per year. Now I set that as my lighthouse application. Say, this is how you move workloads in the public cloud, and you can have proof that it can be done with the right people, with the right engagement, because I'm sure you had engineers, the development teams, all the way through to operations. So talk a little bit about what that process internally looks like for, hey, we've already done this once, and some of the negativity that you might get from somebody else is, yeah, but we're different. You know, we can't do that with our application.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point of standing up this center of enablement is that you don't have those types of discussions where I built this, we're different. You start bringing, those successful applications, those successful migrations up to the front, and you can talk about it, you can discuss, and it opens up the community so developers can actually start having a conversation. It's something we're working on. We're not there yet. We have thousands of applications, hundreds of developers, and of course, everyone is busy. But one of the things that we're trying to do is not reinvent the wheel, right? Because we have a lot of capable engineers solving similar problems, similar puzzles, but no one else knows about it, right? And the only time you really hear something is if it's a failure, right? Then everyone starts looking at things, but it's important, to realize what your failures are, but also to also support and promote what you've been successful at with the same degree of visibility that you do your failures, right? And I think establishing this type of onboarding or engagement helps do that and helps broaden that community where you can start sharing, right? Like economies of scale. I have an EKS cluster. I'm going to use it to deploy my application. Meanwhile, you have another developer in another team doing something similar. Maybe we work together and we just use one EKS cluster, and economies, we save money, right? And then we start learning from each other, maybe create namespaces. So all of that, it's not something that's easily figured out. A lot of the culture has to do with it. Of course, a lot of the procedures and policies around that. But I think once you start having the conversations with this type of onboarding, it helps change that. It helps change the way people operate and the way they move forward with this.
Yeah, when you talked about the differences between success and failure, I tell people, you can't measure success without failing smarter. So I need to be able to learn from the failures and being able to measure it so that way I can publish it. And this is one of the things that I find really difficult in any of the platforms that exist out there is when you start getting transparent about your failures, you have to be willing to own it and being able to say, yes, we did not succeed in being able to do what we wanted to do, but I'm going to have a document at the end that are my lessons learned, and these are the reasons why it failed. Doesn't mean that I stopped trying. I have to go back and I might go and redo it again. And this is something that we see over and over again around security is we see people thinking so much about securing the software supply chain, and when we talk about building a secure on-ramp, that data, again, is becoming critical. And the more data you can collect from a developer perspective while the change is in flight, the easier it is for you to be able to do remediations in flight. We see so many teams today that building these COEs that we've got sort of 3 different layers. There's the proactive, which is using templates and using those for how I build a Spring Boot application, how I build a Rust applications, all of the predefined, approved libraries, everything are included in those projects, as well as the golden path pipeline to whatever cloud resources you're going to deploy to. And then there's reactive, which for app dev is going to be your SAS scanning, your DAS scanning, and then on the operations side, we're going to talk about continuous verification. So I ask a lot of people, I'm like, well, what do you do when I deploy a Docker image in the EKS? And it's really not ephemeral, it's like long-lived, and it's out there for 6 months, and all of a sudden there's a CVE that's found in a package that's in the base image that the developer consumed from operations. Who's responsible for remediation?
No one.
Yeah. So again, having that paved path around those best practices of knowing who is responsible, and a lot of times I tell people it's joint ownership. I'm okay with an operations team coming in and telling me in a merge request, hey, I'm letting you know we found a CVE issue, we're rebuilding your application, and then they make me be a reviewer on that merge request. I can go through and say, oh, wait, you're using a version that I know is going to be incompatible with the application that I'm running. I need to go make some code fixes. Great, I'll go create another merge request, I'll do mine, and then we'll release those 2 components together, but I have visibility into that along the path. The other thing that we have is these custom value streams. So you're going to have different ways of wanting to collect data. And the inside of GitLab, what we talk about with our customers is, I've been working with executives over the last 18 months, and we're seeing 4 primary value streams that come up in every conversation. 1 is improving the developer experience. 2 is establishing high-performing teams like the Dora metrics, Accelerate book, securing the software supply chain, and building a secure on-ramp to the public cloud. And then you take those 4 high-level items, and most executives are like, yeah, we're trying to do all 4 of those simultaneously, and so I say, good luck. But when we take each one of those, I might have an internal library that's being reused. I may not need to do all 4 of those. But I want to be able to have measurements off of each one of those to be able to know which teams are able to be successful off of those. And inside of GitLab, as you can see in the screenshot, is when I have labels that are attached to merge requests and issues and epics, what I'm able to do is I can start to collect data every time those labels are being attached. And then that ends up creating dashboards for your end users to be able to know, hey, this merge request has been open too long. This issue is sitting in a backlog for 6 months. Maybe we move it to the icebox. You now have a management layer baked into the tooling to allow you to know where those measurements actually stand and how you can go ahead and continue to grow your organization. And these value streams end up leading into executive dashboards. So this is, inside of GitLab, you have groups, and subgroups can have other subgroups, and then I can have projects that sit inside of any one of those layers. And when you go to look at the dashboards aren't just at a project level. So if we do have them at the project level, but that might be for the team lead or for the architect of that particular project. But then I might have 25 microservices for a particular application, and I want to see an overview of how all 25 of those microservices are doing and see if there's any gaps. So I can go to the subgroup, look at the exact same data, and it'll show me an aggregate across all of them. I can also drill down inside of that report. Then I've got an executive that goes, well, how are we going against those 4 core value streams? I can go all the way to the main group, the root group, and I can go to that and see the entire line of business. And underneath that line of business, I can see how their software factory is acting. These are things that, as Amato and I loved one of the things that he was saying about, these things don't change overnight. Most of the companies that I talk to today, I'm like, you need to tell me, as a field CTO, I'm not here to help you fix your things for February 1st. As a field CTO, my goal is, what does your 3-year vision look like for your software development? How do you plan to use a public cloud? Are you going to use a public cloud? And then helping them back into these requirements and what data needs to be collected over time. And this is a journey that I know Nasdaq is on, and I've even told Amato, I said, hey, look, we're very close. We're almost at that point where you guys have done such a great job of collecting these metrics that we want to start getting this back into these executive dashboards, and so he can get out of creating PowerPoint presentations and spreadsheets for his boss and say, log into GitLab, here's the link, go, here's all the data, and here's what's important to you. How do you see that data being important to you long term if you look at your vision, your 3-year, 5-year roadmap?
Well, the data is always important. Right now, I don't have a complete picture of how our developers are working, different capabilities within each pipeline, each project. I'd like to see our security posture and testing level across all our apps to be at least the same or somewhere near a certain predefined baseline score, but without having an analytics and insights. You can't really do that. So for me, it's important to start gathering and start reviewing so that we can form a plan and prioritize, what that looks and how we can carry it forward with each iteration. So it's still a work in progress for us. Great. Yeah. Is this available now, the value stream?
Yeah.
Version 15, 16?
I think it was available in 15.0. That was the first time it came out.
Looks good.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for joining me on stage.
Thank you.
So thank you all for attending.
Yes, great.
Impressive.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Probably see you at Replay